Well, hello, everyone. I am Genevieve Randall, Music Director with Nebraska Public Media. We're so pleased to support Lincoln Symphony Orchestra with these pre-concert chats to be able to talk about music, share music, something that both LSO and Nebraska Public Media are dedicated to. This has been a joy to be able to do these via these video chat over these last 19 months. And a really quick reminder that some of these concerts are being recorded and we are airing those on Nebraska Concerts, which is now at 10 p.m. on Mondays. So watch our website for that. Tonight's concert is Brandenburg and Becker here starting at 7:30. So stay with us to hear that concert. And I'm joined for this chat by Music Director Ed Polachek. Ed, great to see you.
Oh, Genevieve, it's always so great to be here. It really is. It's very important because it's not just about being on the radio but being really connected to the community and I miss obviously our live chats with the audience, but this is great because this goes on our website for a couple of days before the concert, and people can pick it up and visit it at their leisure before they come to the concert. And some will then come into the Steinhardt room the night of the concert. I usually greet them, so I get to see a bunch of people, and it's really all about Lincoln and it's all about Nebraska, and that's what I love about it. Music being the universal language as it always has been, it's really, really very special to be able to talk and address everybody via this medium.
I really miss being in the room with people too, but we'll get back to that one of these days. This is a great way for people to get warmed up for the concert. So I have two questions for you to kind of set up our chat for tonight. And question number one is, have you ever been given a gift and then you just put that on a shelf or in a closet somewhere and forgot about it?
Yes.
You have done that? So yes. My question number two is, did you ever then clean out a closet or an attic or something and come across a forgotten gift? And was it as great as the Bach Brandenburg Concertos?
Oh, gosh. That's a difficult one because it goes between something that's very personal, and in my heart and in my mind and in my spirit, it could be as important as the Brandenburg Concerti. But the other part of my musical soul, of course, and spirit, dictates the fact that these concertos are truly remarkable. I mean, truly gifts. And there was so much of the music of Bach that actually found that kind of fate. B minor Mass was another huge work that Bach never heard as an entirety in his lifetime, but they found it in his apartment, all because it was written throughout his life, not at one time. And I don't know if he had this concept of being, something that was maybe spiritual or, who knows? I don't think he wrote for posterity. He wrote for love of God and for the praise and glory of God. And so many at the end of so many of his manuscripts were the initials SDG, which was Solo Dei Gloria, only to the glory of God. His being a church musician for really most of his life, except in that little 6-year period when he was in Curtin, when he wrote just instrumental music and nothing to do with organ or chorus or hymns or cantatas or church music. It was all about this big body of instrumental music that includes the Brandenburg Concertos, the cello suites, the partitas and sonatas for solo violin, so many of the chamber sonatas for violin and for flute and harpsichord and cello. There was just and it was when he was in Curtin he actually referred to that period as one of the most happy periods of his life, which was very interesting. It's the period between Weimar earlier, on one hand, the Weimar, Mühlhausen, and Arnstadt period, which really involved all of his church musician and a lot of his organ works. Then comes the little period of curtain for only 6 years. And then from 1723 to the end of his life, which was over a quarter of a century, he was in Leipzig at the St. John's Church. So you got a very special thing that you brought up here, of discovering these pieces. And probably somebody blew off the dust and said, what could these be, right? And it was actually Felix Mendelssohn, 100 years later, that kind of rediscovered the music of Bach with the great St. Matthew Passion. And then people went back to this genius of a composer. The one thing that I have to point out was that Bach's music was really not popular at the time that he wrote it, and the period for about almost 100 years that followed, because he was, in a certain sense, an end in himself. He perfected the art of counterpoint, and this, what was considered after his death as the old style of music, and was actually even kind of poo-pooed by his children, who said, oh, my dad was an old fogey. No, he went through all that stuff. But he perfected that art in such a way that no one up to his point, up to the point of Bach, J.S. Bach's life, and nor anyone that has ever lived after him, was able to reach that level of mastery and genius that Johann Sebastian Bach actually created. So he is unique really among you composers. And I look at him as kind of the real foundation, the real fountain of what Western music as we know it. You could not have a Leonard Bernstein or a Jerome Kern or an Elvis Presley. You couldn't have any of that great music without a Johann Sebastian Bach. So we really are all indebted to him for what he created in that short period of his life.
Well, and just to keep people with us, I know we're going to talk about another composer coming up here later with our soloist for the concert tonight, Karen Becker. But I want to just talk a little bit more about the Brandenburg specifically by Bach, because two things are happening. First of all, you're directing from the keyboard. I'll address that in just a second here. But the Brandenburgs are uniquely special for a couple of reasons. Each one has its own character and its own highlight and spotlight. So what are we spotlighting and highlighting tonight?
I just love this aspect of them. You really hit on I think the secret of what makes these pieces of music so magical. There are 6 concertos in all. And we are going to open the concert with Brandenburg Concerto number 3, which was originally written for just one player on a part with continuo. Now, what does that mean in lay terms? It means that there are 9 players involved, 3 violins, 3 violas, and 3 cellos that each have their own individual part. And the continuo that we talk about is really the basso continuo, and that changes in the Baroque era or even in the Brandenburg Concertos, depending on what else was scored with it. In this case, because Brandenburg number 3 is only about those 9 string players, the continuo players are the double bass player, to put the kind of the bass bottom on the whole thing, and the keyboard, which I will be at, providing that kind of continual harmonic and conventional addition as a continual player. I think it was kind of during that period that it was very common for the composer and or the kind of the director to direct from the keyboard. Yeah. Interestingly enough, in some of these concertos, the Brandenburg Concertos, Bach probably directed it as when he played the viola.
Wow, interesting.
With the exception of number 5, which has the huge harpsichord solo in it, which he would have played as a soloist. And one of the few things that, as a continual player, he actually wrote out, which is very, very special. I'm doing it kind of a la Bach, a la Johann Sebastian Bach, being from the keyboard, but I'm important only as one of the many players that are involved in these concerti, you know.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you about that because, I think visually to the novice or even otherwise, when we're seeing the orchestra on stage usually, and you're on this podium as the conductor, so the orchestra can see you, there's a kind of a visual element of you being up above to keep the orchestra together. Here you're sitting, and I wondered if you felt like you really are still conducting or whether you're more like in a big chamber group.
I'm in a big chamber group. A lot of what happens in rehearsals, and it's about listening to one another and hearing and how we react to one another. You have to have a leader in order to make that rehearsal work so that you can get to the performance aspect of it, right? And I will be on a very slight podium, only about 4-6 inch high where I'll sit. So I'm a little bit like Lurch, higher, playing the harpsichord in a certain sense. So that, a couple of cues with the hands or a nod, but it's really about the music, and that I really, and the sound of the harpsichord itself that helps direct and keep things together. So that's where we're at with that.
Really cool to hear the harpsichord too. It's a unique sound.
Yes.
I think not everyone gets to hear a harpsichord on a regular basis. It's kind
not
of
at all. Which is why I love having the opportunity to program Baroque music, and of course, particularly the music of J.S. Bach, because it's so such great, incredibly ingenious music. And even though we look at Bach as being, the kind of the king of the Baroque in a certain sense, he is really, truly a very romantic composer. He has that, that heart, that expressivity, those incredibly gorgeous harmonies that make us swoon. And how could you not call Bach romantic? After all, he had over 20 children. So, but let's face it, right? And I have to say about the Brandenburg Concertos as well, that we're following the third Brandenburg Concerto with the first. They were all written for special players. So the kind of the instrumentation for them switches from concerto to concerto. And the first one employs or features 2 horn soloists, 3 oboes, a violin solo, and filled out then with a string ensemble, and again, the continuo, which includes cello and bass and harpsichord. But the textures are they're endless. They're just, you think, oh, it's just a small group. It's phenomenal what this man was able to achieve with just very small forces. It's brilliant and just beautiful.
Totally exploring those colors. Well, I want to invite our guest soloist into the conversation here. Karen Becker is not only LSO's principal cellist and a professor of cello at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Glencore School of Music, also featured tonight, though, on this Kurt Atterberg work. Karen, welcome to our pre-concert chat here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So excited to hear this piece tonight. Kurt Atterberg, Karen, I think we'll just start with him as a composer in general, a composer we might need some more information about. Here's what I've got, and then you can fill in some more, right? Swedish, was a cellist himself, just like you, and was a 20th century composer. Okay, I'm out.
That's right. That is accurate information. And he was born, primarily 20th century composer. He was born in 1887 in Gothenburg and died in 1974 in Stockholm, Sweden. And he actually studied as civil engineering. So he was a civil engineer. He was a composer, mostly self-taught. He did study a little bit in Sweden and also in Germany for just a few years total. And I think, in fact, his composition teacher in Germany was Max von Schillings, and who was friends with Strauss. So I'm pretty sure that he would have met Strauss.
That's
while he was there. Richard Strauss, yes. And this was like 1911 to 1913, somewhere in there, that he was in, I believe, in Munich studying with Schillings. And then he went back to Sweden. And he also, he started cello. Yes, he was a cellist. He started studying cello, I think around the early 1900s, like 1902, I believe. And he established a couple of major composition groups in Sweden, composer societies in Sweden, and was co-founder of those, and was a very active composer, much like some of the other, I can very much consider him to be a nationalist composer, who was influenced also by, he says that he was influenced by Brahms, but I hear more of the, I hear a lot of input from from Sibelius, a little bit from Shostakovich, Prokofiev. I would consider, I don't know, Ed, if you feel like some of his work, some of the concerto is there's a little bit of polytonality going on.
Yeah, it's a kind of work, this was a period where music really there was a big schism in music. There was the old Viennese school and the new Viennese school. And the old Viennese school, with Mahler and those guys toward, stayed with kind of the ultra romanticism and the grandeur and in scope of things. And the new Viennese school did away with a whole bunch of that. And that was, of course, what gave birth to the music of Arnold Schoenberg, which created the whole idea of atonality and serial music. And so there's this split that went that way and this way. There are a number of 20th century composers that are really neo-romanticists, let's face it. You have people like Fauré and Debussy or Rachmaninoff, or you mentioned Richard Strauss, and what it did was it kind of fed into a century, the 20th century, of perhaps the most diverse century in history thus far of the different kinds of music that have erupted in one century.
Yeah. And his cello concerto reminds me a lot of Sibelius, where I picture like these vast landscapes and just these huge soaring melodies that the orchestra gets to play as well, especially the orchestral tutti that occur in the concerto. But yeah, it was written in 1922 is when he completed it. I think he worked several years on the concerto along with one of his symphonies. In fact, he wrote 9 symphonies and 9 orchestral suites. He wrote a number of operas, I think at least 5 operas. He wrote a few ballets. And I think that a lot of his music is played a lot more obviously in Sweden and Scandinavia and in Germany and in other parts of Europe. In fact, I heard part of a recording of his piano concerto that was done in the Czech Republic. So he wrote a piano concerto, a horn concerto,
cello concerto.
He wrote a cello concerto, from what I hear. And then he wrote a double concerto. He wrote a double concerto for violin and cello with string orchestra. And that was later in his life. So yeah, it'll be almost 100 years since he
it's interesting, Karen, because you mentioned Sibelius, a Finnish composer who was, part of that whole Scandinavian, super northern European area. But I also hear things like Grieg, even though he's much more earlier and more romantic, because there's some of those haunting melodies are just beautiful. They tug at your heartstrings. And it's because it is so romantic and because it has a lot of the influence of the 20th century, more modern harmonies, and he created a whole plethora of unbelievable technical challenges for the soloist as well as the orchestra. But I mean, really, it's a brilliant work, and I'm very grateful for you introducing me to it, because I had not known. I'd heard of his name, I knew none of his music, and it's great.
Well, I happened to come across the concerto when I heard a recording. I was listening online, And I heard Truls Moork, who's a famous Norwegian cellist, his recording of the Atterberg Concerto, and I'm thinking, Kurt Atterberg, I've never heard of him. So that was several years ago, and this will be my premiere performance. Our concert tonight is my premiere and the orchestra's premiere and our maestro Ed's premiere of conducting it. Yeah, in fact, Atterberg, I was reading where Atterberg, he conducted the premiere of the concerto. But then I think a year later, he gave the Swedish premiere playing the cello. So he was obviously a pretty accomplished cellist.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. So it's a really exciting piece. I love just how the whole concerto starts with the tremolo and the violins, and just beautiful, gorgeous, soulful melody, and then kind of haunting, and then it kind of erupts into the main theme, the first theme.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's just so exciting to hear about this and look forward to hearing the cello concerto, and to know that there's so much more of Kurt Atterberg's music to get to know, with all of the information that you've provided. We're almost out of time for our pre-concert chat, but I do want to take a minute or two, because Karen, I think since having these members of the orchestra featured, we've had Anton before in past concert seasons, there's been other members of the orchestra featured. It's really a nice spotlight. We get to see all these musicians in a group on stage, right? But now we get a chance to see a little more of certain musicians on stage and get to know you a little bit. So if I could take just a minute or two and ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
What made you choose the cello?
Well, my father was a violist, and he was principal violist of the Huntington Chamber Orchestra in Huntington, West Virginia, where I was born and raised. And the principal cellist in the orchestra, his name was Leighton Conkling. He was professor of cello at Ohio University, and he would play, my dad was good friends with him since they were both principal string players. And I would go to the concerts, and I was in second and third grade. And one year, one of the concerts featured Leighton Conkling playing the Fauré Elegy and the Haydn D Major Concerto. And as soon as I heard the Fauré, I was absolutely hooked.
Yeah.
In love, madly in love with the cello, and that's what I wanted to play. And also he used to tell me, he'd say, "Let me see your cello, let me see your hands." And I'd show him my hand, and he goes, "You have really good cello hands. You should play the cello."
I love it.
which is important. I mean, physically, you have to have that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it helps. It definitely helps. Definitely helps.
So, Karen, do you have different bows that you play your cello with?
I do, and I tend to use the one that I've had for a number of years that I got in Chicago, that was made in the early part of the 20th century, and it has a very light tip. Sometimes I choose to use my actually quite good carbon fiber bow, especially if I'm playing outdoors or if I want to get more sound, and then not super refined, but I want to get more volume. And tonight I'll be playing on a bow that I was bequeathed from my former teacher, my mentor, Phyllis Young from UT Austin. And it's an Houchard bow. Any string players out there would know about Houchard, in the Houchard family of bow makers in Paris. So I'm really looking forward to premiering using this bow with my own premiere of the Atterberg Concerto.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I asked, because I know that the string players do these things. And now we know that there's also a history to that bow that you're using to play this piece that goes back to your history in cello playing in your life, actually.
Yeah, so that's beautiful.
Thanks for sharing that, Karen. Well, Karen Becker, Ed Polachek, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you before this concert tonight. We can't wait to hear these two Brandenburg concertos by Bach, as well as the concerto for cello by Kurt Atterberg. Thanks.
Thank you.